Welcome to the Fantasy Football Brothers podcast. My name is Blake, and I'm here with my younger brother Carson, and we are on to Week 7 matchup previews. Carson, how you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. Was my lead cut into on the predictions? It seems like you're closer than I last remember. I currently 57. I'll say the records real quick. I currently have 57 correct, 37 incorrect, and Blake has 52 correct, 42 incorrect. We're both well above 500, so that's something.
Yeah, so I gained one on the Patriots game last week, and I lost one on which one was it? Oh, the Jaguars that lost in the last 30 seconds. So I should have closed 2 games in on you, but alas, 1 for 1. So same as we were last week. Speaking of, let's talk about this week's bye week teams.
Yeah,
there are some heavy hitters
for sure
missing this week. The 3-3 Rams, they're underperforming. The 5-1 Vikings, I would say overperforming a little bit.
Yeah.
The 5-1 Bills and the 6-0 Philadelphia Eagles.
Yeah, a lot of big teams, and the reigning Super Bowl champs have the worst record out of the 4, which is a testament for how good all 4 of these teams are. I mean, you're missing Cooper Kupp, you're missing Justin Jefferson, so probably the first 2 wide receivers off the board for you. Stephon Diggs, another elite wide receiver, and then the Eagles. I mean, you're missing A.J. Brown, Jalen Hurts, quite a few people there too because they've been doing well, of course, so they've had some good fantasy production. And I didn't even mention Dalvin Cook. I mean, there's a lot of good players that you're missing out of these 4 teams.
100%.
Yeah, a lot of good players. Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, so many. So I'm just going to... I wrote this down, and I saw this as a tweet, and actually twice, so I feel like it's got to be true because I saw it more than just once. But so far this season, fantasy football scores are down 22%. Compared to last season, and I feel it. I feel like I feel it.
I don't know. You look at like some of the scores in our best ball league, and it's like, people aren't really missing many points out there.
Yeah, but we haven't done best ball before. We don't even know if this is the full extent of how crazy it can be. But I know what you're saying. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like in our main league, I'm hitting like 120 consistently, and I'm like near the top of the league with that, and that's surprising to me. So.
Yeah, well,
I don't know.
We'll see. You and I go head to head in our best ball league and our standard or PPR league. So we'll have to talk about that next week, of course.
Yep.
Let's go ahead and move into the matchups.
Yeah, Thursday night football. We have Saints at the Cardinals. Kind of a lot of injuries on both teams. So if the Saints monitor the injury statuses of the Saints wide receivers, Michael Thomas will miss Week 7. Jarvis Landry will miss Week 7. But Chris Olave is expected to return. He was ruled out in Week 6 due to a concussion. So expect him to return for this Thursday. And I think without Thomas and Landry there, he's a must-start. He's making your lineup. Would you agree with Chris Olave?
Oh, yeah. And even when, one or both of those guys were on the field, Chris Olave was still producing at a high clip.
For sure.
And so I like him. He's been a rookie breakout, and that's been awesome to see. Unfortunately, Garrett Wilson, his former college teammate, has kind of fallen off since the return of Zach Wilson, but I'm sure we'll talk more about that later.
For sure.
What about the quarterback?
Yeah, so Jameis Winston hasn't played since Week 3 due to a back/ankle injury, and we see here that he'll be a game-time decision. I'm reading some reports that Andy Dalton might keep the job even when Winston's healthy, just so they're not rushing back into it, and since Dalton has been serviceable, I feel like that seems a little bold because I feel like Winston, even if he has been notorious for throwing a lot of interceptions, he's also been equally known for throwing a lot of touchdowns. So I feel like you would want that high ceiling out of your quarterback. So I don't know. There's probably not too much validity to that. It's probably just something they're saying so that they don't feel like they have to force Winston back in to playing out there. Personally, that's how I feel. But one positive piece of news from this team is that Alvin Kamara had a slow start to the season with some injuries, but he's averaging 20.9 fantasy points in his past 2 games. So, I mean, he's back to that elite where you drafted him value. I mean, you drafted him probably a little bit later than you even should have because of the potential looming suspension, which seems to not even be talked about, but it was always known to be a latter half of the season anyway, so we'll see.
Yeah.
But, that's the Saints. You got anything else to add with them?
How about Taysom Hill? How did you do last week?
Nothing of note, and even if it was of note, I wouldn't believe it. So that's what I'll say about Taysom Hill.
Whoa.
We've done analysis on Taysom Hill.
Let's get a score check. 4.5 fantasy points for Taysom Hill.
Yeah.
Don't be a sucker for those inflated numbers.
Do not be a sucker. We've never succumbed to those point totals because we know the type of player he is, and that does not yield consistency. So, yeah, avoid him. That's what we recommend sure.
I've got breaking news as of right now. Dak Prescott has officially been cleared medically by the Cowboys.
Oh, wow. All right, we'll talk about him more later, shortly, I'm pretty sure.
Right.
So, the Cardinals. The return of DeAndre Hopkins, which is kind of perfect timing because Marquise Brown is currently, well, when I saw this yesterday, he's labeled as out indefinitely. I've read a report today that it seems like a month is the timetable.
Yeah.
A little over a month.
Month and a half.
Yeah. With his foot injury. So, perfect timing for DeAndre Hopkins to step in. And I guess I'll say, besides him, who else do you expect to step up? I mean, I'm going to talk about Rondale Moore and Zach Ertz. Do you think those are the usual suspects?
I think those are two of them. Also important to note, I think, you could see a little bit more involvement from James Conner in the passing game once he gets healthy. We saw that from him. He kind of had that role last season when he was taking over for Chase Edmonds. So I would expect, and I talked about buying low on James Conner a few weeks ago, I think that probably still comes to fruition at some point in the season.
Yeah.
And maybe the absence of Marquise Brown is going to aid in that.
Yeah, because if he gets those receptions, which is something he didn't always get, that's what keeps his floor high, because he's just kind of a touchdown fiend, and you need that because his floor is not that high otherwise. So yeah, that's something to look out for. So with Rondale Moore, he's really involved in this offense, played 99% of snaps, 10.9 fantasy points last week, back-to-back double-digit fantasy scoring performances. I think this was his third game he played this season because he was injured for the first three, that would be, or it was his second, one of the two. But he's involved and he's back in this offense, and I think someone who's had him on my roster the entire time, I feel good about this opportunity that he's stepping into, and I think it will yield consistency for him. So I'm looking forward to that. The Cardinals did trade for Robbie Anderson. I really don't think a whole lot of this. I think that he falls clearly behind Hopkins, clearly behind Moore, and I still think that Ertz is probably the third best receiving option on this team. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, and I think even the ghost of AJ Green seems to still be clinging on to this team. So it'll be interesting to see if Robbie Anderson, carves out a role for himself. Obviously, you and I are not expecting a lot out of him, considering he was the number 2 option in Carolina, and not that that's a very valuable position, but being more featured in the offense in terms of snap percentage, I think that probably that number goes down for the first month or so that he's on the team. It just depends on how it all works out.
Yeah, and as I have mentioned, Zach Ertz, he's quietly been consistent. He used to be that elite tight end, and then they kind of fell off, and now he's kind of had a reemergence and a resurgence. 14 fantasy points, 96% of snaps. He is very involved, and I expect him to take advantage of this absence of Marquise Brown, even though that absence is mainly going to be filled by Hopkins, so it might not be that much different of a situation for a player like Ertz. But I'm going to agree with you. I think the Cardinals, they're a favorite again. I think I got to go with them. I'm not worried about them.
Coming off back-to-back losses, I think going up against a banged-up Saints team with the return of DeAndre Hopkins, I think it's going to be a big boost to this offense.
For sure.
I think the 2-point favorite at home, too many injuries on the Saints. I think they're gonna pull away with this one.
Yeah, I agree. All right, we'll move on to the first Sunday noon game we'll talk about, Browns at Ravens divisional matchup. So for the Browns, it's obviously a offense ran by Nick Chubb, quite literally, but in this game he didn't get a touchdown, and it shows you what can happen when Nick Chubb doesn't get a touchdown. He only had 8 points. He did only have 13 touches, which is low for him, of course, but 12 carries for 56 yards and a catch for 14 yards. We've talked about him as being a sell high candidate because when he was the RB1, thanks to a string of a multitude of touchdowns, that would not be sustainable. So you're still, of course, starting him, but I think that window probably closes, especially if he does another week this week without a touchdown. People are going to remember who Nick Chubb is and why he's not that elite running back as far as fantasy is concerned.
Yeah, and I would say this. I think recency bias goes both ways. It works for you and it works against you in these scenarios. I talked about last week, and that's why I picked the Patriots. I think that Bill Belichick was able to scheme up a plan to kind of limit Nick Chubb's involvement in this game, and I don't exactly expect the Ravens to replicate that. So I think he's going to bounce back. Obviously for personal reasons, having him on my roster, I want him to bounce back. But I think that, honestly, the Ravens defense has not scared many teams or put up much of a fight against offenses putting up points. So Cleveland will get back to business. It's a divisional game, so they're going to play each other tough. But I think Nick Chubb bounces back this week. And let's talk about the pass catchers next.
Yeah, so Amari Cooper is quietly the wide receiver 10. That surprised me, the fact that he's a low-end wide receiver 1. That's way above where you drafted him. And so what are your thoughts on that?
Who he reminds me of? Yeah.
Who?
He reminds me of last season Mike Williams. I think he finished wide receiver 12 or 13, but it was such a volatile wide receiver 13. All the booms, all the busts, they combine to form a top 12-ish wide receiver.
Yeah.
We're seeing the same thing from Amari Cooper now. And so hopefully when Deshaun Watson returns and is leading this offense, Amari Cooper becomes more consistent and up on the higher end of that scale.
Yeah.
But as of right now, we kind of know what to expect with Amari Cooper, who just on some weeks he's going to win you the week. On some weeks he's going to lose you the week.
And either way, you have to start him. So it's not a super fun player to have. When he booms, it's fun to have him, but just from a season-long standpoint, it could definitely be annoying, I would feel. I'll talk about Donovan Peoples-Jones. 33% rostered, so potentially a waiver target. He had 11.6 fantasy points on 4 receptions and a carry for only 2 yards, though. But he's averaging 10.9 fantasy points and 86.3% of snaps in the past 3 games. So he's involved. He's getting a pretty high floor. Do you think he's worth a waiver acquisition?
Yeah, depending on your league size, definitely. He can be a flex consideration in deeper leagues. I'm not super interested in starting him every week just based on the kind of profile that he has on this team.
Yeah.
We've seen him have some really good games, but most of the time he's been kind of quiet on this offense. And so I think you can pick him up and certainly stash him, maybe see if something develops down the road. But for this week, I'm not really interested in starting him.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So maybe worth making your bench and see if he can get even more involved or a potential injury, or just see what happens when Deshaun Watson gets there. So there's multiple reasons to have long-term wise, but I agree that you're probably not plugging him in right at this moment. But with David Njoku, we've talked about him a few times. He definitely peaked in week 3 and has negatively regressed a bit since then, but he's still involved in this offense, and that's saying a lot more than a lot of other tight ends in the league, so I still think he's worth making your team, and I think he is very highly rostered because of the fact that he's a tight end that's involved in an offense, and that kind of checks 2 boxes that many other tight ends don't. So, hope that he can be more consistent going forward for you if he is your main tight end. But I'll go ahead and talk about the Ravens. So, monitor J.K. Dobbins, as he was kept out of the entire second half after his surgically repaired knee tightened up on him. From reports, it seems like this isn't really a worry about him playing in week 7. It's just something that they had to be precautious about during week 6. That's my understanding of it. Obviously, keep an eye on him if this aggravation is serious and could keep him out of the game. But again, this backfield isn't super valuable, as we've said many times. I mean, Kenyon Drake had 19.7 fantasy points on 11 touches thanks to a 30-yard touchdown run. I mean, that's just a Kenyon Drake stat line. From back at the Raiders last season, where he just has a ton of fantasy points per touch. And I don't expect that to be reliable, but they, as previously analyzed, they like to get more than one running back involved. But I will say, J.K. Dobbins clearly was favored over Kenyon Drake in the first half when he was playing, so that's a good sign for Dobbins, but it just didn't turn out for him in this game. And then Lamar Jackson has had 3 straight games with only 1 passing touchdown. It's been a little rough out there for him. Obviously, his rushing floor keeps him serviceable no matter what, and you're still starting him. He's an elite MVP candidate potentially, but look for him to hopefully improve on that. I think still. I think that how he started the season, I don't expect. He just had 3 hot games where he threw, 10 or 11 passing touchdowns, and then the next 3 he's thrown 3 combined. I'm more inclined to believe that he's going to get back on his stride of being elite like that, personally.
Yeah, I mean, he's certainly stumbled in this second half of 6 games played, but I don't know. I still think the favorite's probably got to be Josh Allen.
Yeah.
But,
we'll see.
Just because he's been so consistent.
Yeah, he has, and I think he probably that probably is likely, but Lamar just his ability to be unlike any other player is what keeps him always in that race, I think, for a lot of people.
Or maybe Aaron Rodgers will steal a third one.
Oh, gosh, yeah. All right, so even though Lamar Jackson isn't throwing a lot of touchdowns, Mark Andrews is tending to catch a lot of them, and he's boomed in the last 2 games, so proving to be that elite tight end that you drafted. But monitor Rashad Bateman's foot injury. He has been deemed as close to his return. I believe he practiced today. I could be wrong in that, but just keep an eye on his injury designation. That could maybe provide some more consistency for Lamar Jackson's passing numbers if he has who's looked at as his wide receiver 1 back on the field. So I'm going to agree with you. I think the Ravens are going to bounce back from kind of a surprising loss to the Giants last week and beat the Browns at home. Yeah.
Yeah, my rationale for this is obviously the quarterback play. I think Lamar Jackson does have a better game than he has lately against the Browns. I mean, we watched New England. I think you kind of undersold their performance a little bit when talking about the Browns, but they put up, 38 points. So I think that, defensively the Browns are not where they should be, and
because that should be their strength.
One of the best QBs.
Honestly, that should be their strength is their defense, and if they're allowing 38 to Zappy. I'm sure you'll talk about that offense a little bit later, so I'll save it for that.
Yeah,
all right.
Yeah, baby.
We'll move on to
close out the show.
Yeah, we'll move on to Buccaneers at Panthers. Probably the biggest spread. I haven't checked all the way, but 11-point favorite Buccaneers. But they had a surprising loss to the Steelers in Week 6. And I hate to do this to you, but Tom Brady, 13.72 fantasy points, 8 passing touchdowns this season in 6 games, only 1 interception, so he's not making a lot of mistakes, he's just not finding the end zone a lot. But I'll ask you, is he finally showing his age?
And I will answer you, I don't think so.
Okay.
And here's why. There's a variety of reasons. So he's still top 5 in the league in passing yards, still top 5 in the league in completion percentage. The issues that he's been facing, and we all know it, is that his receiving core has been inconsistent or unavailable this year.
Yeah.
One game at least without Mike Evans, multiple games without Chris Godwin. Julio Jones replaced a very serviceable Antonio Brown from last year.
Yeah. And
Russell Gage, who Tom Brady personally recruited, just isn't the caliber of player to fill in for any of those roles.
Yeah.
So to be completely fair, I think it's really not Tom Brady, and I think that we saw that when he was, getting frustrated with his offensive line. He's just not getting enough help out there.
Yeah.
And 8 touchdowns to 1 interception. You'll take those numbers all day long. If that pace sustains, he's going to have a fantastic season. So I think more likely than not, things are going to pick up when the receiving core gets healthy. And it was just a tough loss. You know, they went for 2, they didn't get it to take it to overtime, and ultimately that's what did them in. But yeah, I think it's been more of a personnel concern more so than a Brady concern.
And I think the absence of Gronkowski really is actually hurting this
team.
I
forgot to mention Gronk.
Yeah, more than even expected. Obviously a Hall of Fame tight end and one of the best QB connections with a receiver ever. But yeah, you kind of expected Godwin and Evans to step up, and they really haven't so far. I mean, Godwin had 15.5 points in this game. It's pretty good, and Evans had 8.2, so not as great.
And there were off-season rumors that Gronk would potentially come back out of retirement,
again.
So don't rule it out just yet.
Yeah, all right. Well, Leonard Fournette is the RB5, so he's still doing well in this offense. He scored 22.1 fantasy points on 27 touches, 3 straight games with the receiving touchdown, so I expect that to negatively regress because Brady's only thrown 8 and Fournette's caught the last 3 on the season. But Fournette's getting the touches, so you have to look at him as that high-end RB1 that he's performing at. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's how I projected him in our preseason rankings, and I'm happy to see that he is definitely paying off.
Yes. All right, so move on to the Panthers. Like the worst team in the league, potentially. Most of the fantasy relevant news regarding the Panthers are preemptive ads amidst trade rumors. I mean, Robbie Anderson left, but it's not like you're like, oh, DJ Moore. But no, because DJ Moore was already ahead of him. He had 3.7 fantasy points in this one. So the absence of Baker Mayfield didn't help at all. that was just a shot in the dark and hoping
and
it would.
Didn't really expect it to. They have announced that Sam Darnold has been cleared to return from IR, so
SC baby.
we may be seeing Sam Darnold sooner rather than later. I don't expect that to help, although he did sustain DJ Moore's value. So
yeah, he started the season last year on fire, honestly, and then kind of fell off the cliff. But DJ Moore was much more consistent.
And still finished with 1,100 receiving yards. So I think Sam Darnold returning may actually revive DJ Moore's value. It still might be time to buy low on DJ Moore. I know that the value, the return that you're looking for from DJ Moore can't be that high, so it would be a good opportunity if you're in a good position to buy low on DJ Moore and see how things shake out.
And Christian McCaffrey's kind of playing more like Christian McCaffrey. He started out the season like consistent, but not really booming, but he's got back-to-back, I believe, 20-plus fantasy points, and you have him on both your teams, so you can probably confirm that, but he's doing very well.
Yeah.
Do you think a preemptive ad of like Deontay Foreman and, in hopes for his fantasy value that Christian McCaffrey gets traded away, do you think that's something worth going after, or do you think him and I guess Chuba Hubbard would split the backfield and it wouldn't be that enticing? What do you think?
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. I haven't really considered that, but I would say that we really don't know if these trade rumors are going to happen. You could certainly make a speculative ad like that, especially in a deeper league where, maybe that kind of bump in usage for one of those guys would make a big impact on your team.
Yeah.
But the problem, I think, and you addressed it, was that you don't really know who's going to take over or if they're going to take a committee approach after that. So,
and if they're not getting those receiving numbers like McCaffrey, which keeps them elite, then it's not an offense you really want a running back in.
It's an interesting conversation to have, but it is, at the end of the day, still very speculative.
Yeah.
And I would probably avoid that team altogether if I could, if McCaffrey leaves.
Yeah, they look really, really bad.
That being said, we're both picking them to win, right?
No, I picked the Buccaneers. I saw you hadn't picked anyone yet. Maybe I thought you'd go against me.
I'm with you.
In this divisional matchup. Yeah. All right. We'll move on to Falcons at Bengals. So, with the Falcons, the backfield is a running back by committee between Tyler Algier, which I think that's spelled wrong, but you can't even see that, so don't worry about it, and Caleb Huntley. So not really much value in this backfield, especially on a team that's usually playing from behind. So don't worry about them at all as far as picking them up. But
they're actually among the highest in the league of rush attempts,
which is interesting. That is interesting, and Marcus Mariota maybe factors in that because he's been rushing the ball more as of late, and
he's probably been running almost more than he's been throwing.
Yeah, he's had 111, and I'll talk about that more in a second, but 111 rushing yards and 1 rushing touchdown in the past 2 games combined, so he's going to get down on the floor. But I still don't really think that's someone you want to add onto your roster, but it's interesting to see if he can throw the ball more on top of that rushing usage. He could have a high floor. That might be enticing, but yeah, do you have anything to add onto that before I get into his passing aspect of his game?
Yeah, not really. I think, honestly, Mariota's been very polarizing this season. He's had some good weeks that were kind of, in part due to his rushing ability. But, yeah, the fact that this offense is just kind of trying to grind out games and not really getting their young, talented receiving options involved, there's very limited upside, I feel like, for this offense in general. So we're kind of waiting to see what happens once Cordero Patterson returns from IR, and maybe that provides a boost to this team overall, but right now it's tough sledding.
Yeah, and to add on to that, it's difficult to want a quarterback whose season high in completions is 20, and that was in week 1. And as you said, it's limiting their pass catchers. It's limited the value of Drake London, even though he gets a ton of a high percentage in the target share of those completions and attempts. But it's really limited Kyle Pitts.
It's like an inflated high target percentage because there are so few targets.
True. Yeah. But it's really harmed Kyle Pitts, as I've said. He had 10.9 fantasy points, mainly thanks to a touchdown on one of his 3 targets. Let's not undersell it. It's his first touchdown in the NFL in America. So wow, I forgot about that. That's funny. That is funny. Played 57% of snaps. What?
That's not good.
What do you do?
That's not good.
What do you do if you were a manager of Pitts? Because you would have hoped that he could tack on a little bit more on that touchdown to potentially make him a sell high, but he still only got 10.9 in that performance, so it's not.
Yeah. So you drafted. I think he's more of a buy low candidate, if anything, but I wouldn't touch that.
Yeah.
You drafted him in the early half of your draft, expecting him to basically fill your tight end spot for the first 13 weeks because he has such a late bye. And so I feel like most likely if you rostered Kyle Pitts, you didn't pick up a replacement during his early struggles, and so you're kind of in a bad position now. You have bye weeks are coming in, so there's less tight ends playing, which means more people are trying to find their replacements for bye weeks. I don't know. To be honest with you, I think you made your bed. You got to lay in it. With Kyle Pitts, and it sucks because the hopes for him were so high. The only thing that I can really think is if Desmond Ridder eventually gets the start, maybe that provides another boost for this team in the passing game. But I don't know. As long as they continue to kind of have a semi-winning record, they're 3-3 currently. I don't know when Ritter's going to get a chance. So with Pitts, if there is someone available on waivers, at this point, I don't know. Maybe Robert Tonyan. We'll talk about him later. But it's looking like slim pickings with bye weeks and everything else.
Yeah, I feel like going into this season and with drafts, we were low on Pitts in regards to his ADP for sure. But I think people were really
lower on his ADP, but not on his talent overall.
I think people were really underestimating the difference between losing Matt Ryan in this offense and going to a quarterback like Marcus Mariota. I mean, Matt Ryan, even if he's not in his prime, he's still slinging it. And I'll talk about what he did in Week 6. He threw the ball a ton. I mean, you were just never going to get that out of a player like Mariota, who hasn't found a lot of luck and success in the NFL. But what's made him enticing as
basically
a prospect out of
at
college is because he has that rushing ability. So that's not something you really love if he's getting it done on the ground, if he is being successful for your pass catchers. He's just a completely different archetype of a quarterback compared to Matt Ryan. So I feel like that should have been kind of more expected, but that aspect of it wasn't really talked about from what I know.
Yeah. And in fairness, I think that, to be honest, Desmond Ridder is, more of a Mariota type than a Matt Ryan type also. So maybe it won't make a big difference. But
give him a chance.
You only know what you know.
Yep.
So,
all right, we'll move on to the Bengals, who kind of looked like a 2021 Bengals offensive performance. Joe Burrow boomed over 30 points. Jamar Chase boomed over 30 points. So you love that. Jamar Chase had 2 receiving touchdowns. That's amazing. Burrow threw 300 yards, 3 passing touchdowns. I mean, this is the team that went to the Super Bowl last season. Here they are. Remember us? That's kind of what it felt like looking at these stats.
Not only that, but it was a homecoming for them back in the stadium where they won their national championship as teammates in LSU.
Oh wow, I didn't even realize that. Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
It was a homecoming for the LSU boys.
Yeah, the game where he threw like 7 passing touchdowns or something like that.
Yeah, just ridiculous stats.
Yeah. All right. Well, with Joe Mixon, he's the only other person I'll really talk about. He had 16.8 fantasy points, but only 12 touches. He did get a receiving touchdown. Are you worried about those lack of carries, or was the passing game just working for the Bengals in Week 6?
Well, no, I'm not worried about the lack of carries because remember last week we talked about how he was 4th in the league in rushing attempts. So he's had the volume prior to this. Yep. The fact that he was able to produce this week in spite of the volume of carries is not really concerning because more likely than not he's going to go back to getting a heavy workload in future games.
I agree. So that's just an example of, sometimes you want to look deep into the stats, but this is an example of one, don't overthink this. This is just how the game went, and you expect him to return to how he had been previously. So I'm going to agree with you and pick the Bengals to win this game in Cincinnati against the Falcons. It seems like they're kind of finding their stride a little bit more. So I think that's good for them, and I don't expect the Falcons to stop that.
Right. We didn't expect the Falcons to take the 49ers down last week, but when they got up big based on some defensive scores, that makes it difficult for a 49ers team that is not exactly an offensive powerhouse to come back. And I think that Bengals have that offense that if they were to find themselves down early, they could rally and pull it out in the end.
Yeah, All right, let's move on to Lions at Cowboys. So for the Lions, they were on bye in Week 6, and they had a shutout loss against your New England Patriots in Week 5. So
Yeah, baby.
I kind of have to go really far back to talk about any stats, so I'm not really going to focus on that. So I'll say monitor DeAndre Swift's injury status for his shoulder/ankle injury. I believe that it's likely that he'll play this week, and they're wanting him to. But if he's out, do you think you have to start Jamal Williams?
I don't know. This might be unpopular to say, but I feel like based on what we've seen from Detroit in Week 5, obviously with the Week 6 bye, as you mentioned, but then going up against a tough Cowboys defense on the road, it's not exactly an ideal starting situation for Jamal Williams. I wouldn't be surprised if you found success last week in replacing him. That you leave him on your bench this week, given the matchup. I mean,
and
let
me just add on. He's a running back that has no receiving floor. So if they're not getting it done on the ground, which probably isn't likely if they're going to be behind this game potentially against a good defense, I think that it's not a given that you have to start Jamal Williams in the absence of Swift. But if Swift's there, you're starting him. But yeah, I would say it's not a given
because he's regardless of game script.
Yes,
DeAndre Swift is always involved, and that's why he's so valuable.
Yep. I expect Amon-Ra St. Brown to have a strong return from bye. Week 5 wasn't good. They got shut out. I believe he was
coming off a 0 in Week 6, right?
Yeah, and I believe that Week 4 I don't know exactly which week it was that he was injured, but then he came back, but wasn't really used to the same percentage of plays, like high snap count, that he had been in like the opening 2 weeks. So I expect him to probably be more healthy and ready to take on basically like all the receiving work like he did in the first 2 weeks. So I expect him to be a strong start again. So expect that against the Cowboys, even though it is a tough defense, as you said, but he is their best receiving option. And then TJ Hawkinson. You got anything to say about St. Brown, although this kind of ties into Hawkinson?
No, not really. I mean, I think St. Brown's one of those players like DeAndre Swift that kind of is always involved regardless of game script. Yeah. So I'm not as concerned about starting him this week as a Jamal Williams, for instance.
Yeah.
But no, I agree with what you're saying. I think Amon-Ra is going to come back and do well. He has most games this week. He's been seeing a high volume of targets, and that really helps his floor in PPR scoring. So yeah, I'm all for starting Amon-Ra.
Yeah, and with TJ Hawkinson, he's yet to boom while St. Brown is active. So if you have that backup tight end option that you had to for sure get last week, and he's more consistent, I don't really think that you have to start Hawkinson. Kind of need to wait and see him do really well while St. Brown is there and just not kind of fall into the shadows. So yeah, that's all I have to say about Hawkinson. We'll see.
No, I agree with that too. I mean, 3 weeks of the 5 games played has been single digits.
Yeah.
It's been a tough season for Hawkinson outside of his Week 4 boom against Seattle. And yeah, I agree with you. If you found somebody that gave you some good points last week while Hawkinson was out, you're not necessarily required to put Hawkinson back in your lineup.
Yeah. All right, we'll talk about the Cowboys. Dak Prescott is on track to play in Week 7, returning from his thumb injury. This should allow for an improvement for all Cowboys pass catchers, as Dak will be throwing the ball much more than Cooper Rush has been. And it's funny, Cooper Rush finally got his first loss as a starter last week against the Eagles, and now he's out. He's gone. It's just the timing of the injury, but it's kind of funny.
Well, it was about time, because honestly, like, it had been such a stupid carnival,
and we've talked about it every week. But
he's my MVP candidate. Like, shut up.
Yeah,
this guy was barely getting by, just coasting off of a good defense. It was just silly.
It's this defense that's
hyping him
allowed
up
them
much.
to have 4 wins. Is that what it is? 4-2. 4 wins.
4-1. Yep.
Yeah. So monitor Dalton Schultz knee injury. He actually was held out in Week 6, which was probably good for managers that had him, because they didn't have to feel like, is he going to play enough? Because that's kind of what happened in Week 5. He was active but wasn't really involved. So monitor.
Well, so sorry, I just want to voice my grievances for a moment, because as a manager of Dalton Schultz, He had no injury designation heading into the weekend, and then was a late inactive for Sunday Night Football, which was actually...
I'll say it wasn't good for you, and I guess I forgot the fact that it was Sunday night, so you probably didn't have the chance, but it did make the decision for you, and you didn't have to say, oh, is he going to be used a lot in this game because he didn't play? That's kind of my point. But
my point was he didn't have any injury designation going into Sunday, so I put him in my lineup, dropped Tyler Conklin, who actually didn't end up doing anything either. He got 2.7 points. But yeah, the fact that he was a late inactive, I think, was kind of lame.
Yes, that is unfortunate.
I feel like Dr. Jerry Jones should have gotten on the horn and been like, hey, Dalton Schultz isn't going to play this week, probably, closer to Sunday.
Yeah.
But that's regardless.
I did forget the timing of things, but I will say, this team has a history of still playing, like what they did to Zeke last year. He probably could have done for a 1 week off, and so if they were being more cautious for Schultz so that he can be back to 100%, that's what's positive about it. But yeah, the timing of all obviously was not. I'll talk about Zeke. Season high fantasy score with 15.6 fantasy points, 61% of snaps. He got that touchdown, 14 touches, 13 carries. I mean, he needs that touchdown, really. He's very
not involved in the passing game. Yeah, not involved in the passing game nearly enough. And a low volume of rushing overall, so just limited touches in this offense. But hopefully with the return of Dak Prescott, there are more scoring opportunities for Zeke inside the 5.
Yeah.
And so maybe his value improves.
Yeah, and for the return of Dak at home, we both agree that they will be able to handle the Lions and win in this game. So, yeah. All right, we'll move on to Giants at Jaguars. With the Giants, I mean, kind of some funny players to talk about. Although monitor Saquon, I think he got switched to questionable for this week, so just monitor that injury status. You're obviously starting him. He's elite if he's playing. But outside other players, which there aren't many, they're all kind of reaches. But Daniel Bellinger, one of the two?
Bellinger. Tight
end. He was 7. Actually, can you check that for me? Check his roster percentage because I did this yesterday before Tuesday night. But 94% of snaps, 14.8 fantasy points, 5 catches on 5 targets, 38 yards, and a receiving touchdown. I mean, very low rostered. Once you find that, announce what the roster percentage is in Sleeper.
13% on Sleeper currently.
Do you think that he's worth picking up as a tight end?
I will turn the question back on you. Would you rather start Kyle Pitts or Daniel Bellinger?
Oh, gosh. Jeez. Well, wow, that's surprisingly difficult.
Put your money where your mouth is.
That's surprisingly difficult. I mean, Bellinger had 37% more snaps. And he's playing on a better team. Wow.
Right.
I guess... I don't think you can start Kyle Pitts. That's crazy. Wow. That's crazy. I'm glad I don't have Kyle Pitts because that 15 seconds
But I think that kind of
deciding
puts things in perspective for this player. Obviously low yardage amount, but if he's getting 5 targets a game, that's usable at the tight end position. I think this is more a argument for just quit mandating that you have a tight end in your lineup. Just increase it to 2 flexes on your roster, and that will change so much of how you play the game. But no, I don't hate the prospect of Daniel Bellinger as a pickup. Obviously, not rostered in many leagues at this point. So, yeah, certainly a consideration. I think you're picking him over Kyle Pitts. I don't think that's actually that crazy in this game. So, I think good find on that one.
Thank you. I mean, someone has to rise out of all these injuries of this wide receiver core and tight end spot. But yeah, another player I'll talk about in the receiving core is Wan'Dale Robinson, the rookie. 12.7 fantasy points, 3 receptions on 4 targets, 37 yards, and a touchdown. So he played 23% of snaps, so he really helped him that he got that touchdown. But this is his first game since week 1, only his second NFL game ever. So do you think that he could be more involved and be reliable?
So I like Wan'Dale Robinson as a speculative ad. He's somebody I think I mentioned in preseason about taking a late round flyer on just because of the potential upside as a slot receiver in this Giants offense. Someone that I'm not exactly rushing to start this week based on that snap percentage, but a speculative ad for sure. We'll have to see kind of how the injuries shake out on this roster. It seems like last year it was a similar scenario. We were talking always about wide receiver injuries for the Giants. Not much has changed here, and Wan'Dale Robinson may find himself in a bigger role on a surprisingly 5-1 Giants team.
Yeah, and they handled the Ravens last week, and that was surprising, as I've already mentioned in this episode. But yeah, it is interesting for sure. So let's talk about the Jaguars. And I've noticed that they really have had a huge change in their offense from weeks 1 through 3 compared to weeks 4 through 6. So I'll do some analysis on that. So Christian Kirk averaged 20.9 fantasy points in weeks 1 through 3, and has averaged 7.06 fantasy points in weeks 4 through 6. And it's correlated to Trevor Lawrence, 25.6 pass completions in that first half and 18.6 in the second half. So he's throwing the ball on average 7 fewer times a game.
Significantly less.
So that is a big difference. And Lawrence also threw 6 passing touchdowns in the first half and 3 passing touchdowns in the second half. So half the passing touchdowns. So I feel like, what do you make of that? Do you expect him to be able to return to how he started the season, and thus that will be good for Christian Kirk and even players like Zay Jones? Or do you think that, what do you think is more representative of how they'll be the rest of the season?
Well, I'll say this. I think they were robbed last week against the Colts, and I picked them to win that game, and unfortunately it didn't work out. But I think that based on who they've played in the last 3 weeks, so at Philadelphia, then home to Houston, and then at the Colts, I think you kind of got to throw out the Houston game because that was a weird, 6-9 was the final there. Playing Washington and Indianapolis at home, which they crushed, and at the Chargers in week 3, those are different kind of opponents, I feel like. So I'm not really sure which is going to pan out to be more the norm in these two splits, but I will say that I think Trevor Lawrence is continuing to improve as a quarterback, a young quarterback in this league, and
it's much better than last season.
And I think more likely than not, they're going to figure things out and kind of return back to the first half split that you were referring to. It's a tough spot when you have Christian Kirk, who's been struggling, when you have these running backs that we'll talk about next that have just kind of fallen off the face of the earth. And we can go ahead and move on to that if you'd like, because I think the decrease in Trevor Lawrence's passing volume, you would think, would reflect in an increase in rushing volume,
but it really
just hasn't been the case.
Yeah, because James Robinson's volume has declined relative to that first half versus second half. Major decline volume from weeks 1 through 3 compared to weeks 4 through 6. So it's just really this entire offense. James Robinson in week 6 played 43% of snaps, 6.5 fantasy points on 13 touches, only 1 reception. Whereas Travis Etienne, 12.8 fantasy points, 10 rushes for 86 yards, 2 receptions on 2 targets for 22 yards, 46% of snaps, or 3% more than Robinson. Is Etienne trending in the correct direction?
Sort of. I mean,
no, I get it.
What we have seen, because this whole offense is kind of trending in the wrong direction generally. So Etienne has been very efficient on the ground when he's gotten those carries. Still not much involved in the passing game as you'd like to see from him, someone that was kind of profiled as that kind of player in college, which, by the way, playing with Trevor Lawrence, so you would expect more chemistry there than what we've seen so far. But, maybe this given matchup requires a little bit more involvement from Etienne in that pass-catching role, and Trevor Lawrence can kind of get right in this week. The more I talk about it, the more I'm leaning towards picking the Jags in this one.
Yeah, this is difficult.
I've kind of been picking the Jags a lot this year, and it really hasn't paid off for me. And
it's difficult. I'm kind of surprised the Jaguars are the favorite. They are at home. I'm going with the Giants, but honestly, this is difficult either way, and I hope Saquon plays, because if Saquon does not play, I don't really have a lot of reason to pick the Giants, but I think he could be a difference maker in this game. Yeah. But it's risky.
Yeah, I think, I don't know what the weather is for this game. Obviously, Jacksonville can get a little wild at times.
Yeah.
But I think I'm going to go with the Jaguars on this one.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. This is definitely an interesting matchup for sure. And we'll move on to...
Don't let me down, Jags.
Yeah, we'll move on to the Betsy's favorite team, right? His girlfriend. We'll move on to the next game. Colts at Titans. Divisional matchup, I believe. And with the Colts, we have Matt Ryan, who I alluded to earlier. He threw the ball 58 times for 42 completions. Now, I don't expect this to continue, but he is known to be throwing the ball a lot, so he is capable of a game like this. This production allowed my boy Pittman to boom again with 16 targets, so that was great. But we'll analyze two other pass catchers. Paris Campbell, 18.7 fantasy points, 7 receptions on 11 targets, 57 yards, and a receiving touchdown. Played 100% of snaps. But this was his first double-digit fantasy score of the season. And then meanwhile, we have Alec Pierce, the rookie, 13.9
Yeah, by over
points.
10 points, by the way.
Oh, like that so his 8.7 or lower was his ceiling.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
8.3 was his previous season high. So as much as this is like a neat story for Paris Campbell, I don't think it's something that you can trust moving forward.
So that's one answer.
That's my take on it.
Yeah, so I'll talk about Alec Pierce because maybe you feel a little bit better about his consistency. Although 65% of snaps compared to the 100, that is interesting. But the rookie, 13.9 fantasy points, did catch a touchdown, 3 catches, 3 double-digit fantasy scores in a row. That's what's better about him. So do you think he's more reliable?
I do like Alec Pierce better. I think that they're going to find a way to get him more involved in this offense, taking on more of a snap percentage role. We've seen Paris Campbell struggle, just kind of exist in the NFL for the past couple seasons, and I think that Alec Pierce is obviously not a first-round draft pick, but still a talented young rookie that seems to be, gelling well with Matt Ryan, and that's important too. Yeah. So I do have a larger belief in Pierce than Campbell moving forward on this offense. And I think he's a good speculative ad. I've talked about that before.
Sure. Running back Deion Jackson, I had to add the position to make sure we knew who I was talking about. Scored 28.1 fantasy points with 10 receptions in the absence of Jonathan Taylor and Nyheim Hines. He's just going to go back to the middle of nowhere whenever Taylor comes back. But I think anything to pull from this is that if Taylor's out again, it's not just automatically the Nyheim Hines show.
No, and that's a good point. Although Deion Jackson did kind of do a very good Nyheim Hines impression with that amount of receiving game usage. Yeah. So, if anything, maybe it's possible Deion Jackson replaces Nyheim Hines moving forward.
Yeah, that is interesting.
That's a consideration. Yeah. So, although I don't think that's the most valuable role on this team, we haven't seen Nyheim Hines produce at that position when he was healthy.
Yeah.
It just kind of makes it more perplexing that we haven't been seeing more success from Jonathan Taylor when he's healthy.
That is true. And I think he's expected to play this game, so see if he can prove us wrong and prove that value of being drafted at the 101 in drafts. We'll talk about the Titans, not for very long though, because it's not a fun offense to talk about. Treylon Burks was placed on IR before the Titans' Week 6 bye with a toe injury, so he'll be out. Kind of the only glimmer of hope outside of Derrick Henry, of course, of this offense, with him being a rookie. But do you expect Robert Woods to step up in Burks' absence? Maybe.
Well, we talked about this back in our Week 5 preview. Here's what he did. 4 catches on 8 targets for 37 yards. That's not good.
No.
This is a low-volume passing offense.
Yeah.
I've talked about it all preseason long. I've talked about it all season long. This is a running team. Derrick Henry is the only player that you should be starting.
And he's back to booming. He kind of had a slow start relative to what you drafted him at.
He stumbled at first.
But he's back to being, it's just Derrick Henry. They should rebrand to the Tennessee Henrys because that's what their offense is. They really are nothing else. And they are somehow the favorite. They somehow have a winning record, but we're both disagreeing with that and saying on the being the favorite aspect of it. Can't really disagree on the record.
Yeah.
But picking the Colts to win away in Tennessee in this divisional matchup. And I agree with you on that.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's move forward. I'm gonna take over here. So let's talk about Packers at the Commanders. There's a fun one for you. So let's start with this. Aaron Rodgers continues to underdeliver. Currently ranked as QB 20. He is averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game on the season.
Ouch.
Is it time to give him the speech? It's not me. It's you. Are you ready to break up with Rodgers?
That's horrible. I think that he definitely deserves to be on your bench. I don't know about dropping him just because he literally was the MVP last season, even if we kind of disagree with that. But, you know, he doesn't have his weapons. He's lost Devontae Adams, so it's not super surprising, and he's an aging quarterback. But, yeah, you don't have to start him off of name value. So listen to the numbers.
Certainly not. I would prefer a lot of quarterbacks ahead of Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah.
So 13.5 fantasy points for your QB is pretty much not an option.
No, not envious of whoever potentially drafted him as their quarterback one, which hopefully they didn't, but it's definitely possible that they did.
It was something that we talked about being a good strategy in the offseason, and I think we definitely share the blame with a lot of people that were promoting that same kind of idea, waiting on quarterback, but we didn't expect it to be this bad. That's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, with how it's gone so far, I almost never draft those elite, Allen, Mahomes quarterbacks at their ADP, but with how it's going, I mean, I'd take Allen at that ADP all day compared to a lot of these quarterbacks that people are forced to start week in, week out. So it's been weird. There's been weirdly no depth at the position this season.
Well, and there have been a few values at later in the draft, like Jalen Hurts and Joe Burrow, who's come on as of late. So, but I get it. No one is doing what Josh Allen's doing on a weekly basis.
Correct.
Let's talk about the running backs now. And unfortunately, more bad news. Aaron Jones, 7.5 fantasy points last week. Only his second game with fewer than 10 fantasy points, but with a season average of 13.2. His floor is always kind of flirting with close to 10 points per game. That's just not what you're looking for from someone that you likely drafted in the second round in most leagues.
Yeah.
He's consistently getting 3 receptions per game, all but in week 5. Only 2 touchdowns on the season. Both came in week 2, so you kind of don't like that. He had 1 boom week on the year.
Mm-hmm.
I do expect positive regression moving forward with the touchdowns, but this offense kind of needs to figure things out. And keeping everything in perspective, Jones is still the running back 14 on the season. He does remain an RB2 in all leagues.
That is surprising, and I think that has a lot to say of how we opened this episode of just overall being lower on the fantasy scoring this season. But yeah, RB14 with someone almost every single week. We're like, who do you like more out of this backfield? And yet Jones is RB14. It says a lot about what one boom week can do for a player's rank, especially this early part of the season, but we're approaching halfway almost, so it is surprising.
We are almost midway, so 13.2 is not what you drafted him to do on a weekly basis, but it's almost as good as what you're getting from Aaron Rodgers. Wow. Back to the other backfield mate on this team, A.J. Dillon, 9.2 fantasy points here. He has had 5 consecutive weeks with single-digit fantasy scores. It is a middle-of-the-pack matchup for running backs. Washington ranks 25th in rushing yards allowed per game. So is there any chance that sways your decision in flexing Dillon?
I think it's difficult to... this is why I didn't want to draft Dillon, because you draft him in a spot where with your depth you almost have to start him. But I feel like that's hard to do, and I feel like we say that every week. You do like the receptions, but I don't know. When you see that rank for rushing defense, it could very easily be a week where Aaron Jones just booms. So it's so difficult to have either of them, and we have both faded having really almost any Packers player. So it's all about your depth. I think that he's got a safe floor, but I'm not super excited about him.
Well, and the floor the last 5 weeks has been single digits, so I think if you're looking for upside, look elsewhere.
Yes, if you're looking for upside, for
That's
sure.
my perspective. I mean, because even with Washington ranking so low against the run, A.J. Dillon himself is averaging under 50 rushing yards per game thus so far. So I don't really see things changing this week. Talking about the pass catchers here, both Allen Lazard and Romeo Doubs had 9 targets and caught 4 passes, but Lazard found the end zone for the 4th time in 5 games and finished with more yards than Doubs with a split of 76-21. For now, I think you keep Doubs on your bench as he's averaging 42.5 receiving yards per game since week 3, where his snap percentage increased to 86 or higher. Lazard feels like the safer play among the two. I know we talked about, who would you rather have the past couple weeks between Lazard and Dobbs. It seems like Lazard's the one. And then moving on to the tight end conversation here, this is going to be similar to my analysis of David Njoku's big game. Robert Tonyan finished last week with 19 fantasy points from 10 catches on 12 targets for 90 yards. Solid day. Absolutely love that production from a tight end. Unfortunately, he probably wasn't on your roster, so he couldn't help you with that. And in his career, Tonyan has played 3 games where he had been targeted 7 times or more. That was his previous career high. Last week increased that number to 4 games, making 12 targets his new career high. This is his 6th NFL season. So let that sink in. 4 games with 7 or more targets in 6 NFL seasons.
Yeah.
This is a bad spot. Tight end's a wasteland. Do you think that Robert Tonyan is the answer? To which pass catcher do you want to start on this Green Bay offense?
Oh, no.
I mean, the numbers are grim when you look at it like that.
Yeah. I mean, 2 seasons ago, I think it was, I remember he was just like elite tight end because he kept on catching touchdowns. But he just doesn't seem like he's the type of player that would yield consistency. I feel like that's the 3rd time I've used that phrase today. It's really working. So no, I don't really believe in Robert Tonyan as being the pass catcher I want in this offense. I think that he is a good add, especially in leagues where you have to play a tight end because, well, I don't even know his roster percentage in leagues where you have to have a tight end, but not everyone had him to start the season, of course. But, I think Lazard getting the touchdowns makes you think that for sure he is the pass catcher to have right now, and I think Dobbs being a rookie and getting involved is still promising. So no, I don't look at Tonyan and think...
Yeah, I'm not advocating for you to drop Dobbs, but I think he needs to stay on the bench until further notice. Yeah. He's just not getting enough receiving volume.
Agreed.
With yardage or touchdowns, so makes it tough to start him every week. Moving on to the Commanders, Carson Wentz is expected to miss 4 to 6 weeks with a fractured finger that required surgery. Not officially on IR as of yet, but is Carson Wentz droppable in leagues without an IR spot?
Yeah.
Hanging on to Wentz, who's been struggling the past few weeks?
Yeah, you have to, because, we've been talking about the fact that, you're still starting... No, you have to drop him, I think. Have to is probably strong. You definitely can drop him. How about that? I feel like we've been saying, is he still a good fill-in for your bye week quarterback? And if we're having to ask that question, you're not rostering him without an IR spot for that long. So, I agree.
Okay, that's where I feel as well. Let's talk about the running backs next. Brian Robinson led the team in rushes with 17 for 60 yards and a touchdown, a late touchdown that kind of saved his day on 47% of the snaps. He has yet to be targeted in game through 2 weeks. Basically makes him a touchdown-dependent flex at best until that changes. We'll see how Taylor Heineke fits into this offense and how it affects the running back usage among this committee. Antonio Gibson played a season-low 26% of the snaps and only managed 5 carries in Week 6. I would probably venture to guess I know what you're going to say to this, but with single-digit opportunities in back-to-back weeks, are you holding or folding on Gibson?
Folding. He's just getting phased out of this offense. Like we always called him a returner.
He's returning kicks.
We called him a returner going to the season.
He is returning kicks. He was returning kicks in that game against the Bears last week.
That's what he is, and that's weird. But
yeah,
it's weird. His third or fourth season, I think third, and they're just giving up on him for this rookie, which I don't know.
Well, it's not from a lack of trying.
I guess not. But
and to keep in perspective, it is his 3rd season this year.
Yeah.
He finished last year as RB12 and the year before as RB13 as a rookie. So it's not as though he wasn't getting volume and usage. But I think they've found what they like more in Brian Robinson, and so it is kind of an interesting development, but it's something that we knew about going into the preseason.
Fair enough. That is true. That was the sentiment around Gibson going into the season for sure.
Moving on to the pass catchers here. Curtis Samuel, season lows on all fronts. 2 catches on 5 targets for only 6 yards. That's like a running back stat line. But without Carson Wentz, are you wanting to wait and see how involved Samuel is with Heineke in at quarterback?
I think that's probably fair because Wentz had really been slinging it, and Heineke probably won't do the same. I know he's got experience with this offense, but not really with Curtis Samuel being healthy. So I think that is fair to wait and see with him, but I do expect him to still be consistent. And I see you're about to talk about Terry McLaurin. I would say yes, because I see you have a question there, and I feel like I'll just answer this right now. I think the process is different for
Okay,
McLaurin.
well, hold on. Let me ask it first. So, back to Terry McLaurin. Sorry, it's for everyone to be able to hear it. Terry McLaurin's in a very similar boat to Samuel by stats over the past 3 weeks. We've been comparing them pretty closely over that stretch, excuse me. But with the benefit of playing most of last season with Heineke, is your thought process different for McLaurin?
That is the key, playing a lot of last season with him. And going into this season, we were like, McLaurin's the wide receiver 1, and then like Dotson's maybe the 2. Like, we weren't even really thinking about Curtis Samuel. So I think that McLaurin clearly has his role in the offense no matter who the quarterback is, and I think that therefore you have to assess him differently. Hopefully Samuel can get back to his early season performances with Heineke, but yeah, it's more risky.
Yeah, and Terry McLaurin was last season's wide receiver 25 with Heineke at quarterback, so I kind of expect, if anything, for things to improve because they can't really get worse, right?
Yeah. I think that's fair. I'm picking the Packers,
so who are we picking in this one?
I guess.
Yeah, it's two. I am as well. I don't love that I'm picking them to win just based on how poorly they performed last week. But I still don't really believe in this. Gosh. I'm still holding out hope that Rodgers is going to figure it out. That's really what it comes down to. Because I could sit here and convince myself that Taylor Heineke is going to take this Commanders team and inspire them to play against a struggling Green Bay offense, and I just don't know if I can really convince myself of that. This is not the hill I'm gonna die on. I'm gonna stick with you on the Packers for this one.
Yeah.
All right, man. I've got all the gross games so far.
Yeah.
Next one is Jets at Broncos. Zach Wilson's pass attempts have decreased every week since returning to action in Week 4, going from 36 down to 21, and then down again to 18. These are pass attempts, by the way, not completions. All pass catchers are unplayable until Wilson improves or gets replaced, and he won't get replaced as long as they continue to win. The Jets are surprisingly, against all odds, they are 4-2.
Yeah.
Breece Hall continues to be a fantasy rock star among rookie running backs and running backs in general. Any concerns, though, that he will stumble against Denver and potentially have his first single-digit week?
If that means Broncos did well, I hope so. But no, I think Breece Hall's legit. I mean, is it impossible for him to get single digits? Of course not. It's not impossible. But I think that he is very legit, and they're wanting to use him a lot, and he's been consistent. Mm-hmm. So this is a tough defense, I feel, because they keep that offense in games. But yeah, I think that you're still pretty confident in Breece Hall.
Okay. To me, this is a week where I'm a little hesitant, or I'm lowering expectations for Breece Hall.
Yeah, which is different because you're starting him no matter what, I presume. But yeah, maybe lower your expectations. I think that's fair.
Yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say is it would not shock me because I asked the question. It wouldn't shock me if he was a single-digit scorer this week.
Sure.
Moving on to the Broncos, it was another miserable display of offense on Monday Night Football in Week 6. We watched this game together. And I think we were both surprised when we saw Latavius Murray taking control of the backfield against the Chargers, logging 15 carries for 66 yards on 47% of the snaps. They kept cutting over to Melvin Gordon, just looking sad like he lost his dog before the game. Mike Boone and Melvin Gordon combined for 4 carries and 9 yards in Week 6. Boone also caught one of 4 targets for 3 yards as well. So here's a bizarre coaching nugget for you.
This.
Gordon has been named the starter for Week 7. So I don't know how much longer they're going to give Nathaniel Hackett, but apparently Melvin Gordon's the starter this week. Do with that what you will. I'm keeping him out of my lineup if I can afford it, and I'm sure that I can afford it based on where Gordon went in drafts. I really want no part of this rushing offense.
It's like if he can take snaps away from Javonte Williams, how can he not do that for Latavius Murray and Mike Boone? It makes no sense.
Yeah, I think it's definitely bizarre coaching, and we've seen a lot of that this year from Denver. So moving on to the pass catchers, Jerry Jeudy averaging fewer than 10 fantasy points per game. This makes me look really smart with how I was pushing for Cortland Sutton early in the preseason. 2 games with 15 plus for Jeudy. 4 games, one of them with him leaving early with injury, with fewer than 8.5 points. And then Cortland Sutton played 100% of the snaps for the first time this season. You probably think, oh, he must have done well. He caught 2 of 3 targets for 14 yards, so that's odd. But as our resident Broncos fan, what's your advice to those who roster Jeudy or Sutton?
I think that you have to have enough confidence in Sutton, just because he has been consistent before this game, relatively, has been putting up reliable numbers. It's so difficult because Wilson actually started the game pretty productively, being a high conversion percentage, decent amount of passing yards, a passing touchdown, I believe, and then just the second half just completely fell off. So it's hard to find any reason or rationalization for it. So if you have someone who's been consistent, I don't think benching Jeudy is that bold, but
yeah,
it's just you expect this team to get something going. Maybe it's just it's so hard to talk about this team at all because it's so many different fingers pointing in different directions about what could be wrong with the offense, and I know it has a lot to do with coaching, causes a lot of that, so it's difficult as an outsider to predict that. So yes, for Sutton, I think he's been reliable and consistent enough to be okay, one bad week with statistically. Jeudy doesn't really have that luxury as much, but he should be doing better than averaging fewer than 10 fantasy points per game. So I don't even know if I really gave you an answer, but that's how I feel about it.
I think what I pulled from that was you're still starting Sutton, and with Jeudy, if you have other options, probably use them.
Yeah, I wouldn't say don't bench them out of spite, but if you have reliable options, go for it.
Yeah, let's pick this game. The Jets are 1-point underdogs on the road. Yeah, I think you're begrudgingly taking Denver.
I am begrudgingly taking Denver at home. I think that their defense is going to be good enough, and I feel like if Melvin Gordon is given the opportunity, he really will help this offense. So it makes no sense why they managed him the way they did last week. So that's how I feel.
Yeah, I don't like doing this, but I'm gonna take the Jets on this one. Division rival with the Patriots, obviously, but I just don't believe in this Broncos offense whatsoever.
Yeah.
All right, moving on to Texans at the Raiders. Dameon Pierce, obviously Texans coming off of a Week 6 bye, but Dameon Pierce coming off a 20.3 fantasy point performance back in Week 5, including 26 carries. Pierce is a solid RB2 with upside moving forward if this workload sustains. There's no really indication that Rex Burkhead is going to be involved like he was early in the year anymore. So good signs for Pierce there. Moving forward to the pass catchers, I've got kind of an interesting, we should have done a blind resume with these guys. But with Brandon Cooks, he has scored single digits in 3 of 5 games, played this season, averaging 10.7 points per game overall. Vegas struggles defending against the pass thus far, ranking 24th in passing yards allowed per game. Is Cooks still flex-worthy coming off a bye?
I think just because of the opportunity and volume, I still have faith in him. Averaging 10.7 fantasy points, as you see right here, is not great at all. But, as you've said, it's a good matchup. And I think that you drafted Cooks because he is clearly the wide receiver 1 in this offense. Now, it's not a great offense, but I think that he still should be in consideration for making your starting lineup just because of that. And, there's only so many games where we can talk like this and he doesn't perform to where you're finally going to feel like, okay, I can't trust him. But maybe it's because I don't actually manage him, so I'm not constantly worried about this decision, but I feel like you can still flex him.
Yeah, and I think the split of more single-digit games than double-digit kind of gives me the edge of saying with Cooks, you can look elsewhere for a flex. I wouldn't be shocked and say, what are you doing not starting Cooks at your flex this week, but just based on how he has performed. But he does have a pretty safe floor, just not much of a ceiling guy, and hasn't really shown it so far this season. On the other hand, Nico Collins has scored 10-plus fantasy points in back-to-back weeks, going back to weeks 5 and 4, obviously, averaging 80% of the snaps in that 2-game stretch. Is Collins flex-worthy coming off a bye?
See, that's what's so weird.
It's kind of the same
That's
argument.
what's so weird. It's like, why is he the one that's
him.
finding more consistency? You know, I think I would probably have a different opinion if I had Brandon Cooks on my team. I'm not really thinking about this Texans offense a whole lot. But you talked about Nico Collins weeks ago as a good ad, and that obviously has paid off. But it's hard to find a reason as to why it's not Cooks that's finding consistency, whereas it is Collins. So, again, it has to do with your depth. If you want to trust those stats or you want to trust that player, that's what's up to you on deciding Cooks or Collins, respectively, on who's on your team. But yeah, I'm not giving you a lot of answers.
Sitting
It is because it's a bad offense with you'd assume that someone has to emerge, at least one person out of the pass catchers, and it's not the one you expect. So it's hard to like definitively and adamantly champion either one of those players, but it's got to be someone.
Yeah. So I'll say this. In deeper leagues, I think Nico Collins is flex-worthy. And I'm also saying that, maybe in more standard 10-team or 12-team leagues, you can possibly do better than Cooks. So that's kind of how I view the situation. Let's go ahead and talk about the Raiders now. Josh Jacobs is the RB7 on the season, despite being on a bye last week. 5 catches in each of the past 3 games, averaging just over 20 carries per game in that span as well. So he is getting very good volume. This is someone that we were kind of thinking, wow, is he even going to have a role on this team when he was playing in the Hall of Fame game in the preseason? But this usage makes Jacobs a must-start. Moving on to the pass catchers, Devontae Adams is unlikely to be disciplined by the NFL until after the legal process for his misdemeanor assault concludes. I mean, it was a big story heading into the bye week.
And then the bye week happened.
His court date is set for November 10th, so no need for panic in the immediate future. Although that, potential suspension, if it's just a fine based on, what his conduct was on the field that day, if that is the result, then that does not affect fantasy managers. But if he does face probably just a 1-game suspension, if I had to just make a guess. But yeah, that's something to consider as that date approaches. But moving on to Darren Waller, need to monitor his status. He's got a lingering hamstring injury, and that's been a theme. We'll talk about that in the next preview. But it has kept him off the field for most of the past 2 games, and that's concerning to say the least if you drafted Darren Waller. So monitor that as we move forward. Let's pick this game. I think we're both probably, obviously, picking the Raiders in this one. They are 7-point favorites at home.
They have a surprisingly bad record for, I think, the team that they are.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that they honestly deserve to have their record with Denver swapped, although that's just not how things work.
Yeah.
But let's go ahead and move on to the next one. This is the Seattle Seahawks at the LA Chargers. Ken Walker definitely rose to the occasion when asked to handle the lead running back duties in Week 6. He logged 21 carries for 97 yards and a touchdown, while also catching 2 of his 3 targets for 13 yards. That's all good usage there. He is an RB2, much like Dameon Pierce, with upside moving forward. Poor performances through the air affected Metcalf and Lockett in significant ways, but this was to be expected. We talked about this in the preseason, that at times this season with Geno Smith at quarterback, these guys were going to let you down on occasion. So I'll ask you, do you expect a bounce-back week for Geno and his pass catchers this week, or more of a repeat of Week 6?
It's difficult because it seemed like we had turned a corner going into last week of Geno being able to provide for fantasy pass catchers in Metcalf and Lockett, because what a performance like this last week is kind of what was more expected, as you said. So I would say I expect him to bounce back, but I feel like I think you got to be cautious, but you're probably still able to start Metcalf and Lockett, especially Metcalf, I would say. But
And what about starting Geno?
I don't think I wouldn't be starting Geno. I know that if you have Josh Allen or Jalen Hurts, that maybe he could be an option, and maybe in that, I guess in that.
You know that
case,
he's QB7.
Yes, and it's surprising. I know I talked about him last week being super high.
Yeah.
I wouldn't. No, that's the distinction I'll make. I don't really feel super great about starting Geno, but I think you can still feel pretty good about Metcalf and Lockett.
Okay, I think that's fair.
Yeah.
I think this game kind of has sneaky shootout potential. We've seen it from Seattle in the past, although last week is a very poor example of that against Arizona. But moving on to the Chargers here, Austin Eckler logged a monster PPR stat line versus the Broncos, catching 10 of 16 targets for 47 yards while also finding the end zone once on the ground off 14 carries for 36 yards. He has 6 touchdowns in the last 3 games, 6 touchdowns. That makes 6 touchdowns in 6 games played. So he's kind of back on pace for something that we were talking about, him facing regression this season. It's not really working out that way after the last 3. Eckler is the RB1, and his passing game usage will keep his floor high, so no complaints there. You're going to keep rolling him as long as he is healthy and on the field. Someone who has stayed healthy and on the field but has been inconsistent is Mike Williams. He was the recipient of the Pat Surtain shadow coverage treatment in Week 6, only catching 2 of his 6 targets for 17 yards. And to be honest with you, Carson, I think that we both agree with this. This is more indicative of Surtain's talent. Surtain's talent as a young DB in this league, rather than Williams' struggles. As we know, he has boom-bust potential every week.
Yeah, Williams has been super consistent, especially in the absence of Keenan Allen, which I can't wait to talk about him next with his injury designation. But yeah, I think Pat Surtain is legit. So yeah, I think that's just more of, as you said, props to him more than anything else.
Yeah. Agreed there. Moving forward, continue monitoring Keenan Allen. This has been a very, very long stretch. This injury occurred in Week 1, if you can believe it or not, a hamstring strain. As we know, he has been day-to-day for weeks now, and I'll ask you this because I think it's a little interesting. Are you considering trading Allen if you've held him thus far?
Like someone wants Allen from you.
Like give someone else the problem. Yes. Like, are you like if someone made an offer for Keenan Allen, and I'll expand on this. If they did, what value does Allen demand in return?
I feel like.
But first, answer the question of: are you considering trading Allen if you've held him?
Yeah, I think you can. If you're nervous about this potentially being his age that is kind of slowing down this process, and that he's not going to get back to his heights, then I think now is the time to trade him, because you're getting him at a value where people are like, oh, he's back. He'll be good for the rest of the season probably. And I think that his value probably demands like a wide receiver 2. It's probably where you drafted him. And I think that people are still going to believe in this offense. Still probably will believe that he's going to be the more consistent one between him and Mike Williams. And I think for a lot of people, Allen was their first wide receiver drafted. I think potentially where he was going in drafts. Potentially, if you went heavy on running back, but he definitely was in that range where he could have been either wide receiver 1 or wide receiver 2.
You're absolutely right.
So I think wide receiver 2 value is definitely fair, and I think that if someone has survived without Allen this long, and they're not confident on him being reliable health wise, then I think
Well, I think it's actually from the perspective of you can't afford to keep him any longer.
Sure.
There's a team in our league that has him that's near the bottom of the standings that's been holding on to Keenan Allen, and I reached out to them asking if they would be interested in trading him, and they're like, well, I think I got to hold on to him, and I thought that was interesting. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is a fair perspective. If you've waited this long and you aren't worried about him, I guess that's what it is. If you're worried about him, I think now is the time to trade him, because players or other managers will be like, he'll be good. But if you aren't worried about him, you're probably like, no, just let me have him, please. So
yeah, which if he plays this week, it'll be great. But then week 8, he's on a bye, so you will be without him very soon again.
Wow.
We're both picking the Chargers to win this one, 6-point favorites at home over the Seahawks.
Yep.
All right, let's talk about Chiefs 49ers next. Another bad game for CEH, only 9 carries for 33 yards. He had 0 targets in this game. The usage has mostly stayed the same, but the touchdowns have gone away, and you can't really expect much better at San Francisco. It's a tough matchup. And then I'll just ask you kind of a general question. Any meaningful takeaways for the KC pass catchers in this game? Obviously, Travis Kelce is still amazing, but we saw a good performance out of Juju Smith-Schuster. So what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I'm looking at these stats right now. I think that it's reassuring to see Juju kind of take on that wide receiver 1 role, but again, it is Travis Kelce and kind of everyone else. If Juju can find consistency, because this is the first game he's really boomed and only the 3rd time out of the 6 that he's had double digits, you like that, but I really don't think you can roster it. That might be bold. I don't think you need to roster Marquez Valdes-Scantling, who 82% of snaps, 3 targets, 0 catches. Mecole Hardman, there's no reason to roster him in my eyes. Sky Moore, if you still believe in him being a rookie, but I think he's not going to do anything this season. So I think it's Juju, Kelce, those are the pass catchers. And you got to hope that Juju can find consistency, and if you have Kelce, you're very happy.
And I think it's interesting, too, because from someone who was at the game, you saw that MVS had what was almost a touchdown called back due to holding. It kind of would have changed his outlook moving forward, but I think you're mostly right. I mean, and this is something we talked about in preseason, that Juju was going to be the most obvious choice outside of Travis Kelce to take on a role in the passing game. I mean, we talked about how MVS spent his entire career playing with Aaron Rodgers, who prior to this season was not a bad quarterback. So it wasn't really a fair argument to say, yeah, but now he's playing with Patrick Mahomes. The truth is that he really just hasn't stepped up in any capacity in his career. Nothing has changed in that regard on his stint in KC so far. So yeah, I think you're on the right path there. I think Juju, if he can find consistency, will be a valuable asset on your team. And outside of that, it's kind of more of a risky flex play. So I agree with that. Yeah. Moving on to the 49ers here, Jeff Wilson really underperformed in what should have been a great opportunity against Atlanta.
What was that?
0.5 fantasy points. He had, they were down early. 7 carries for 25 yards and a fumble lost. Where does Wilson rank for you this week as a running back 2, a flex, or a bench?
I mean, he's a flex at best. I think that you can still probably play him and hope that this was a blip because his usage had been so good, and this is usually a running offense, but for whatever this week, there were a lot of valuable pass catchers to have. So I think that, and like you said, it's because they were down early. I expect this defense to keep them in games to where running the ball will be reliable, and I think that Wilson still should make your lineup. But yeah, that scares you, and I think that knocks him down to a flex, if not that matters too much because he's still in your lineup. But yeah, I think that it has a lot to do about the game rather than his prospects as for his role going forward in the offense. And I mean, Elijah Mitchell is still weeks away, right? So I mean, they still got to be running with Wilson as their main guy.
That's a fair point, but I feel like also that the Chiefs' offense, is one of the most explosive in the NFL, and so what do you believe in more, Patrick Mahomes in that offense or the 49ers defense to keep them close?
Well, I think that's fair. I mean, what happened with the Falcons game? How much did they go down early? I don't remember how it panned
14.
out. Okay, so they went down. Yeah, I mean, it's not impossible that the Chiefs, just because they are a good offense, make that happen. But I think if you think you're starting to overthink it a little too much, if you're really trying to predict game script too heavily. So I would say that, I mean, he's had a very, very valuable role to have. So I think after 1 week, you can't just completely say, oh, I'm not starting him. If he does it again this week, then you got to be worried about who they're playing against.
Yeah, but that 0.5 fantasy points really stings.
Yeah. I was like, is the game over when I looked at it? Yeah, it was bad.
Yeah. Moving on to the pass catchers like you referenced, they had some pretty big weeks here. Brandon Ayuk went off in week 6, catching 8 of 11 targets for 83 yards and 2 touchdowns. And I'll just ask you straight up, is it time to sell high?
I think that's a good opportunity to sell high. I mean, we got Garoppolo will be the quarterback the rest of the season. And you know, Ayuk found some consistency in the latter half with Jimmy G last season, but at the end of the day, he kind of fell behind Debo and Kittle, who you'll talk about
at times, yeah.
next. And like I said, I mean, this really is a rushing offense, whether it's through whoever the running back is or Debo Samuel. So, yeah, I think sell high would be a smart thing to do, but you got to feel good if you have.
Well, and I think it's been a good sign to see that Debo's rushing volume has been significantly lower than where we saw it at last year.
Yeah.
Only 2 carries in this previous game. But on to George Kittle. He had his best game of the season by far, catching 8 of 10 targets for 83 yards. Got you 16.3 fantasy points. You'd love to see that. If you've been starting Kittle through his struggles, you're thrilled to get a game like this. But if you've added a usable replacement off of waivers, is this past performance enough incentive to trade Kittle away and ride with the replacement tight end moving forward?
I think it depends on the rest of your lineup, because you're only realistically going to start one of those tight ends, I presume. And if you're needing depth somewhere else or another starter, I mean, it's possible you could play them both, have one in the flex, but not likely.
I wouldn't advise that.
No,
we talk all the time about tight ends being terrible.
Well, I'm just saying, if you have this backup tight end that's emerged, and I can't even think of a good example, and Kittle potentially looking like Kittle, it's not
Tyler
impossible.
Higbee.
Yeah, sure.
Who's on a bye this week?
Fair enough. Okay.
So
I believe in Kittle.
Either way,
I believe in Kittle. I think this is a good sign that when he gets into this consistency, you know what type of player he can be. But if you have that reliable tight end behind him, which can also be equally hard to find, and you need depth somewhere else, then yeah, I would pawn off Kittle. But I think that if you're worried about starting Kittle going forward, personally, I think you got to feel better now.
Okay, so not to get too hung up on the idea, but like if you roster David Njoku and George Kittle, are you comfortable moving from Kittle?
What worries me about Njoku is that he's kind of week 3 was big, and then week 4, 5, and 6 is like eh. So to lose Kittle if he's potentially having the inverse scenario, that would make me a little bit nervous. So
you're leaning more towards keeping him?
I would lean more towards keeping him unless you really are forced to start a player at a position that you don't want to because of depth somewhere else on the team. So it's relative to your roster, but I feel good about Kittle.
Okay. Understood. Yeah. We're both picking the Chiefs to win this one on the road. 2.5-point favorites for them. I don't think the 49ers defense is going to be able to keep up.
Yeah, close loss last week against the Bills. I expect them to maybe come back with some vengeance in this one.
Yeah. Agreed. Moving on to Sunday Night Football. This is kind of a underwhelming primetime event here. Mitch Trubisky was forced back into action. Sorry, I don't even think I said the matchup. Steelers at Dolphins.
Yeah, there you go.
Mitch Trubisky was forced back into game action after Kenny Pickett left with a concussion. The new concussion protocols make it difficult for players to be cleared in time for the upcoming week's matchup. That is not a critique, but it is important for fantasy managers to kind of adjust accordingly because that is a new development. They've tightened up on those protocols based on what happened to Tua earlier this year.
Yeah, and as you've said, that's good. But difficult.
Yeah, no, it is. It's good for player safety and health, and it is a little bit more challenging for fantasy managers. So it's important to know that.
Yeah.
Knowing what we saw from Pittsburgh prior to Pickett's takeover of the role, not much really changes regarding the outlook of skill position players. You're still starting Deontay Johnson, who's averaging 9.5 targets per game. George Pickens and Chase Claypool are flex considerations depending on your league size. And Najee Harris remains a low-end RB2 with upside, although it's been difficult to watch him so far this year.
Let me jump in real quick. I did see that, absolutely. Again, you're not excited about Najee, especially if you draft him in the first round. But he did clearly hold off Jaylen Warren. So what we were talking about last week seems to not really be an issue with the usage of Najee. So that is definitely positive to see.
and I talked about that.
Yeah. So, yeah, you feel better about that. And, yeah, you can continue on.
Okay. Last thing I was going to say was just monitor Pat Freiermuth's status. Also in the concussion protocol that held him out last week. He was a serviceable tight end prior to injury. So if he's playing, I think you can probably plug him back into your lineup, assuming that you don't have a really good starter option that you're more comfortable with. Okay, moving forward.
I agree.
With the Dolphins. Cool. Moving forward with the Dolphins here, Teddy Bridgewater returned to action following another Miami quarterback injury, forcing Skylar Thompson with a thumb injury out early. Tua has been named the starter, so we're rooting for him to stay healthy and pick things up where he left off earlier this season.
I'm no neurologist, if that's the proper doctor for this, for dealing with concussions, but I'm still a little surprised that he's just back like that. I mean, back in the day, had a minor concussion, and I feel like what has been 2 or 3 weeks since he's been out. I would say his concussion was fairly worse than mine, and to think that he's already back and could potentially, be taking hits again, and that makes me nervous. But I hope he'll be okay.
I think that's kind of interesting.
I'm no medical professional, so I don't know what the norms are, but it's just, we were worried about its movement in the extremities just a few weeks ago. It's just crazy.
Well, it's been over 3 weeks. I get where you're coming from on one perspective, but if he's cleared the protocol and he is showing all signs of being healthy, I don't necessarily think it's too soon for him. I mean, how long do you want him to hold out for?
I can't make that judgment. I'm just thinking about it.
Right.
Yeah, so I hope it's fine. That's all I can say.
Okay. Well, I mean, like I said, we're rooting for him to stay healthy
for sure.
and pick things up where he left off.
Yeah.
So, with his pass catchers, Tyreek Hill has remained efficient and usable by a very strong margin. He is the wide receiver 3 and continues to dominate, putting up numbers no matter who's in at QB. Jalen Waddle, on the other hand, finally bounced back after 2 consecutive sub-6-point fantasy weeks. 16.9 in week 6. He had 6 catches on 10 targets for 129 yards. Did lose a fumble. That's unfortunate. But I think, both of those guys, no doubt starters. Onto the running backs, however, how do you rank Raheem Mostert this week? Is he an RB2, a flex, or a bench for you?
Let me remind myself of these stats again. Yeah. It's difficult. I don't know how much I trust it, especially with, who knows what's going to happen with this offense. I do think that for the long run, Mostert is the running back to have, but Edmonds had his value when Tua was there. But so it's just to see Mostert. So let me just say, Mostert, yes, is the one I think is going to continue, assuming he's healthy, to be the running back to have.
Okay.
But he's had most of his best.
Flex? Is he a bench?
That's my point. He's had most of his best performances without Tua whenever they actually were running the ball a lot more. So I think that flex at best, but I wouldn't blame you for being cautious and not starting him this week when they could potentially be back to throwing the ball much more than rushing the ball.
Okay, I think that's completely reasonable.
Yeah.
Let's pick this game. The Dolphins are 7-point favorites. I think we're both going that direction.
Yeah, I think so. Assuming that Tua is just back at 100% playing.
Well, and especially if Mitch Trubisky's in at quarterback. We've already seen how ineffective they've been under him. So I think, this one's kind of obvious.
Monday Night Football!
Right, we're on to the main event.
Yep.
Okay. Bears at Patriots. 8-point underdogs are the Bears on this one. Justin Fields completed 14 of 27 passes for 190 yards and a touchdown. Also threw an interception all the way back on Thursday Night Football in Week 6. A season high of 12 carries for 88 yards. You like that?
Yeah.
If the passing volume sustains and Fields continues to put up numbers with his legs, he will re-enter conversations as a streaming option at quarterback. However, at New England is not the week to start Fields in fantasy. And we've talked about this on a few different occasions, such as Jared Goff in Week 5, and you weren't starting Jacoby Brissett, so that's not really a conversation. But New England has allowed 15 points total to opposing offenses over the last 2 weeks. They're looking like a defensive juggernaut out here, and Are there any Chicago players you're still starting and or flexing on Monday Night Football?
What is going on with the running back situation? Because that's probably the only... I'm pulling that up right now to remind myself because I didn't really...
Yeah, so there's reports indicating, obviously David Montgomery got most of the touches, but Khalil Herbert did break a long run. I think it was 64-yarder for a touchdown.
That is true, yes.
So
I see that.
he pretty much cut one direction and then returned the other way. Ran a lot longer than 64 yards on that play. We'll just say it that way.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was David Montgomery handling the majority of the workload. And then, of course, the head coach has indicated that they're considering a hot hand approach at running back. So that does kind of that kind of throws everything into.
But is that enough to make you bench David Montgomery?
I don't know. Is it? Because based on how New England is playing defense and this offense, I don't know. Can you? You can probably bench him.
They have a legit defense, no doubt. But that doesn't mean you can't start anyone. But yeah, I mean that's not a good.
Carson, the reason I ask is because New England's playing fantastic defense and the Bears are not a good offense. They put up 7 points last week.
That is true. Yeah.
So it's really all about.
Defense.
Yeah, it's all about how much risk you're willing to take on.
That's true.
With the comments about the running back situation being a hot hand approach,
that does hurt his, potential. He's been looked at as having like a high floor, and that's why you would start him. So if that hurts that and a bad matchup, I get what you're saying. So yeah, maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe not any.
The trouble
Chicago
is, it's
players.
Monday Night Football, so you're either going to have to bite the bullet in one way or the other.
Yeah. Ugh. All right.
So
some of these players that we're talking about, I'm very happy I don't roster. How about that?
Okay, so just who? Okay, are you flexing David Montgomery? I'm putting you on the hot seat.
Again, it obviously depends on your team. I think that you can. I think that you can.
Okay.
I think
for me,
it might be a little bold. Sorry, I just think it's a little bold, depending on your running back depth, to just bench him because of the matchup and what they're saying about how they're going to use their running backs, which always.
What part of that is bold to you? I don't want to get too hung up on this, but I'm just interested. Where
I just think because he's been a pretty consistent option. I mean, he's had 2 double-digit scorers. He had week 3. Okay, let's go down the line. 8 points in week 1.
Okay.
15.6 week 2. Week 3 got injured, 1.1. Week 4 was out. Week 5 came back, 18.2. Week 6 had 9. He's been close to double digits every single week.
Yeah. So he's a flex.
Sure. Yes.
And then given the matchup, does that change anything? You're saying no.
I just don't think that you can't trust anyone against a good defense. I think that we're
okay.
We'll see.
Yes, we will see.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other.
No,
I'm just
I know.
trying to get you to answer the question.
It's just difficult because it's a team that has been playing amazing defense as of late.
Yeah, going up against a bad offense. So it all kind of combines. But
I'm just,
let's go ahead and move on.
Yeah, go ahead. That's fine. Move on. We don't need to talk about that anymore.
So, coming to a primetime game near you, The Pursuit of Zappiness. How do you like that one?
I like that.
Possibly continuing in Week 7. We do need to monitor Mac Jones' ankle injury status. But either way, I like New England's chances at home. And then moving on to other players here, Ramondre Stevenson is RB9 on the season.
Yep.
He continues to be a must-start as long as Damian Harris is inactive. We expect him to be inactive this week. And then I want to ask you a quick little news or noise. Tyquan Thornton played a jack-of-all-trades role for New England in his second game as a pro. 4 catches on 5 targets for 37 yards and a touchdown. Also found the end zone through the ground on 3 carries for 16 yards. Played 57% of the snaps. So I'll ask you, news or noise for the second-round rookie wide receiver?
I think jack-of-all-trades for an unknown... Well, he's a rookie. For a player that doesn't have a lot going behind them fundamentally for stats. I mean, like they don't have a big foundation of having a role like this. Like a Debo, if you saw a stat line like this for Debo, you'd be like, oh, good game for Debo. But any other type of player, pretty much anyone else, you're kind of like, noise. Because you don't see that jack of all trades designation and think that's going to be reliable. I mean, he was drafted because he was like the fastest wide receiver. in the combine. That was a big thing for him. So obviously they're wanting to get him involved however they can. But this offense isn't good enough for me to want to use this gadget.
Okay. So I view it as a good speculative ad, depending on the depth of your league, of course. The deeper, the better.
Yeah.
But I think it's interesting because he did miss the first 4 weeks of the season with, I believe, a collarbone injury. If that's correct, I'm not sure, but missed the first 4 weeks with injury, and only his second game as a pro, them using him in a variety of ways, I think is intriguing. And so I'm not advocating for starting him this week,
Sure.
but I think he is a good speculative ad, something that could develop more as the season goes on. And that's kind of how I view it.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, if someone's sitting at the bottom of your bench not doing a whole lot, of course, go for a guy that they're trying to get involved. I just think it's not going to amount to any sort of consistency personally, but I see where you're coming from.
Yeah. Okay, so picking this game, obviously I'm choosing the Patriots to win this one.
Yeah,
and I think you're not going to be so bold to go against me on that one.
No.
So that wraps things up. Anything you want to add before we do the outro?
You had a lot of difficult questions for me about gross players, about should you start them or not. So I'm sorry for a lot of fence sitting. It's difficult. No, it's good questions. They're good questions because there's stuff that people are dealing with.
My intention, right, it's that people are finding themselves in tough positions with these players, and I want to put out the idea that, hey, this person is a lock-it-in, like, position 2, like, fill in the blank, or a flex, or a bench. Like, these are all considerations that managers are making across the leagues that are being played. So
just know with anything we say, and I pretty much say this every single time, it's always relative to your other options. So keep that in mind, and hopefully you pick the right one.
Okay, well, next week maybe it can be a goal for you. Throw some tough ones my way.
Okay.
And we'll see how I handle it.
Yeah, because I just feel gross sometimes. Sorry, but go ahead, yeah.
Okay, thank you for watching and or listening. This has been an awesome experience. We are officially 1 year and 1 week in the books on this podcast.
Yes.
Hope you're enjoying it as much as we are, and we'll see you again soon.
Yeah, thank you, and peace out, everybody.